Good morning. Thank you for joining us once more, and we hope you'll stay with us. We'll keep the discussion to an hour as we generally do, and I will try to talk for 20 minutes or less, and then the rest of the time will be spent on questions. I'm sorry for starting late again. We usually try for 9:30. Last night we had a late night though. We had the Monday night forum in Caroni Central. The Honorable Political Leader, Mrs. Kamala Prasad Bissessa, was there as the main speaker. And we had a really fine group of speakers. We had young Damian Gandhi from the constituency, who is a young MBA and very involved in the youth and now elections officer of the constituency. And we had Tahaka Ubika, and we had Marsha Riley, and of course myself as the MP for the area, and Mrs. Bissessa, as I mentioned, as leader of the opposition and leader of the party. Now, today, now there's a lot of discussion and talk about sedition and the law of sedition, and what are the issues of freedom and freedom of speech that particular issue raises. And I need to try this morning to put things in context. I need to try this morning to put things in context because we actually have a situation here which, if we focus on the issue of sedition alone, which is a very important issue of how a government should behave, these archaic laws, the interference with freedom of speech, etc. But I think the larger issue here, especially with this government, is the issue of democracy. And the first thing I want to say to you is that V.S. Naipaul wrote a novel, his second published novel, I think, called The Suffrage of Elvira. And in that Suffrage of Elvira, he deals with the politics of Trinidad and Tobago and perhaps the untidiness of it, perhaps sometimes the comments of it. But he deals with a fundamental issue because he was making the point that in the transfer from the colonial power, which was Britain, to Trinidad and Tobago and the emergence of national politics for things like seats, places in the legislature, and so on, he was making the very, very important and fundamental point that election alone does not a democracy make. In other words, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have elections every year, and that is a democracy, and it's very important to have free and fair elections. If you have elections and they are not fair, if you have elections and they are not free, if you have elections and it is not so open and facilitative that every citizen who has a right to vote, and that means every citizen, regardless, there are no conditionalities in this, every citizen get the opportunity to vote. That is very important. But if you had to wait every 5 years to establish the nature of your democracy, we would be in a very bad situation. So the issue that arises is what are the elements in between elections that make for a democracy? And how does a government behave in relation to the democratic process? Now, if you have a strong government with a strong state, control of the institutions of a society, all right, control of the laws, and being in a position to execute power at will, then that weakens the democratic process. And therefore, what we have in our democracy is this separation of powers, as many democracies do, whether it is the United Kingdom, whether it is the United States, whether it is even different kinds of democracies, because not all democracies are based on parliamentary systems or the American system. So the issue of the separation of powers is very important. And what does that mean? It means, first of all, when the elections come every 5 years, you elect the members of parliament. And in our system, we have two houses. So we have the Senate as well as the Parliament. And both the Senate and the House of Representatives is based, first of all, on party representation and on the will of the people in electing representatives to the House of Representatives. And then the parties nominate people to the Senate. And in our Constitution, the President, seen as a person above the political fray and independent in thought and spirit, and therefore independent of both government and opposition, and linked to the notion of the broader will of the people through their institutions, appoints people to the Senate. So you have the Parliament as the first pillar in the separation of powers. The second pillar in the separation of powers is the executive. Now, the Parliament makes the laws, they debate and they make the laws. And Parliament is meant to engage the people. Every time you have a bill before Parliament, it really should be put out for public comment, so the public should could have an opportunity to comment on it or ask for meetings, etc., to have things explained. And interest groups who have an interest in the bills normally ask for meetings. And if the matter is very controversial, you have the opportunity of a joint select committee or a select committee, which can then engage interest groups separately and then come back and report to Parliament, and you then have a debate. So that is how Parliament is supposed to operate. They make bills, and there's a consultative process provided for in the making of bills. The second part is the executive. The executive comes from the Parliament, and based on our system, which is really a first past the post system, the executive comes from the party that wins the most number of seats and has their and gets an opportunity to determine the prime minister of the country. Now, the executive is really constituted through a cabinet. So we have cabinet government, and every week they meet, they make cabinet decisions. Some of those are brought to the Parliament to be made into law. Some of the issues are brought to Parliament as policy. Some of them are brought to the country in terms of announcements by cabinet, what they call these cabinet briefings. And they announce what decisions government has made. Some are done by press conferences. Some are done by information given to the press press releases and so on. So you have, but the cabinet and the government is accountable to the parliament. Okay, so the separation of powers is that parliament shall make the laws, cabinet shall make the policy, all right, and execute the policy, but cabinet and government and the prime minister are accountable to parliament. And the third part of the separation of powers is the judiciary. And the judiciary shall interpret the laws that parliament makes, and therefore use its interpretation of the laws in order to render justice. Now, we have a problem in Trinidad and Tobago where the justice system is a serious problem. It's dysfunctional because you take so long to get your case before the court. Sometimes you are imprisoned for long periods of time before you get to the court. So those are things in the judiciary that need to be solved and settled, because justice delayed, as we say, is justice denied. So if you have a man in jail for 10 years or 5 years before his matter comes up before the court and he is in the remand yard, that is not fair. And suppose that person is acquitted on the charge, that person would have already lost 5 years or 10 years of his life. And sometimes the crime that he committed is less than the time that he spent in the remand yard. So that is a problem. And if you have matters that do not involve people going to jail, but is awaiting basically the time when that case is called in the court and you are waiting 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years, sometimes 15 years. That is a real problem because you are not getting justice. The matter is before the court, but it is not resolved. So these are serious problems. But the point I want to make is that in the separation of powers, the parliament makes the laws on behalf of the people. The government, through the cabinet, makes policy and executes that policy, but is accountable to parliament. And the judiciary interprets the laws, and on the basis of the laws, they then make judgments. And that judgment is supposed to be involved in the dispensation of justice, but the dysfunctionality of the judiciary creates a problem for the efficient management of the judiciary and the efficient execution of justice. And therefore, those are issues. But in addition to this separation of powers, there is the idea in a democracy that certain things are sacred. I did not bring the Constitution with me today because I did not want to have a pedantic discussion with you. I wanted to have an open discussion. I just want to raise the issues and we can talk. If it is necessary, we can bring the Constitution to say what the Constitution says about our rights. But in the Constitution, there's a general preamble which basically outlines the kind of society that we are aiming to be. And then beyond the preamble, you have basically the rights of the individuals in the society as opposed to the responsibilities and obligations of every citizen also in a society, in a democracy. And within the framework of the separation of powers, you have the governance system, and under that governance system, you have the institutions of society that are meant to operate in the citizens' interests. And then you have civic organizations that are facilitated by the constitutional process, in which people get together to represent their interests or to do things in the society, and therefore they play a role in the democratic process. So democracy is something that takes place every 5 years when you have an election, and that is an important part of democracy. The democratic process is governed by the separation of powers, the judiciary, the executive, the parliament. And in all of that, there is a notion that all of these institutions are really accountable to the people who can elect the parliamentarians, who can determine the government, and who, although they do not elect the judges, expect the judges to be responsible to what is happening to society, what people are saying, what people are thinking, and therefore respond to that in their notion of what justice properly executed means. And Parliament, of course, is supposed to respond to the people in making the laws of a society and consult with them as may be required. Okay? So during the 5 years, one of the fundamental principles of democracy is the freedom to think, the freedom to speak, the freedom to express your opinion, the freedom to write, and the freedom to advocate your cause. Okay? Now, there are limits to that. You are not supposed to do things that are violent. You are not supposed to do things that infringe on the rights of other people. You are not to be subversive of the state and the state apparatus, and you are not supposed to do things that undermine the functioning of the society. But beyond that, you are allowed to say and do almost anything as long as you do not interfere with the rights of others and hurt others or accost or infringe on the rights of others, and you are supposed to have that freedom. And what that means then is that the concept of dissent is fundamental to democracy and the democratic process. If you do not have the right to dissent, then you do not have a democracy. The status quo will always prevail. It will speak its truth. It will not be challenged, and the status quo will continue unabated. But I want to say something to you. You know, we admire people who have made a difference in the society. I think that there are very few people who would not admire the role that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi played in the wresting of independence for India from the British. It was the first country to do so in the British Empire, and the role he played in the thinking and transformation of that country, India, which today is emerging as a major power in the world. I think most people today would have respect and admiration for Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, during the 1960s, challenged the status quo on many fronts. He fought for social justice and the rights of downtrodden people, and the people who were especially downtrodden at the time were black people in the United States, African Americans, Afro-Americans, they used to call them at the time, who were part of a Jim Crow system that had emerged out of slavery and the slave system. And there was a kind of apartheid in the United States in which also, although certain rights were guaranteed, people who were black did not have those rights. And in fact, all people of color did not really enjoy the full rights in the society. And Martin Luther King fought that, but he also got involved in international issues. He became a serious critic of the Vietnam War that was being waged by the United States and other allies in Vietnam. And therefore, he was a dissenter. He was a critic. Gandhi was a dissenter. He was a critic. And I think most people would remember and admire the leader in South Africa who basically dismantled the apartheid system. I think Nelson Mandela is regarded almost as with a sense of sacredness. And the reason for that is not only that he dismantled apartheid and became the first black African, South African, to become the prime minister of that country, but they especially admired him for two other things, which is that he, instead of going for revenge, he went for peace and reconciliation in order to give the society a chance for forgiveness and to stabilize the society and not to create these conditions for disorder. And I think the second thing that they admire him for is that he took power and he became the prime minister. And as soon as he could, after one term of office, he handed it over. Because to him, the future of the society, democracy in the society, the continued development of South Africa was more important than his holding on to power. But a person called Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau was an American who lived in the New England area of the United States and was a part of what you might call the transcendental movement, that is to say, people who were trying at that time to develop a philosophical basis for rationalizing the nature of American society following the formation of Constitution, the battle with England for independence, and of course trying to forge and form a society called the United States of America. And Henry David Thoreau wrote a short piece called Civil Disobedience. And in that Civil Disobedience, he says this sentence: I was not born to be forced. I will breathe after my own fashion. That was also the piece in which he talked about marching to the beat of a different drummer. In other words, making the case for individualism and the assertion of individual will. Okay? That was also the piece in which he said that when a government is oppressive and it begins to interfere with the rights and freedoms of the individual and the good functioning of a society based on mutual respect, then the citizen is within his right to oppose and to resist that government. This is in the United States now, all right? The country that people see as the seat of democracy, and which we see the Constitution being tested now in the wake of a new president in the United States, President Donald Trump, and with all the institutions really being tested in that country and the Constitution itself. So, What is the connection between Henry David Thoreau and the three gentlemen that I mentioned who are so admired in the world for their stand for freedom in their different situations, but who based their entire life and career on the principle of dissent, and dissent which is essential to democracy? Henry David Thoreau was very influential on Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He wrote in the 19th century, and Gandhi was able to read that. Gandhi was also influenced by people like Tolstoy. When I was an undergraduate in the United States, I was at Northwestern University, and I was doing a course on 19th century literature, and I wrote a paper, all right, which was very, very well thought of by my professor, a great professor called Harrison Hayford, who was one of the world experts at the time on Herman Melville, the great American writer, and who had done perhaps the finest edition, which continues to exist today, on Moby Dick. And I did a paper then on the influence of Henry David Thoreau on Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. So Henry David Thoreau influenced him. Gandhi, of course, influenced Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King would have read Henry David Thoreau. If you ever go to Atlanta, you will see that there is a Martin Luther King Center. And if you enter that Martin Luther King Center, you will see that there is a whole wall that is dedicated to the relationship between the writings of Gandhi and the influence of those writings on Martin Luther King. So that, you know, ideas connect and they make a difference in society, and they cause change, or the fermentation of ideas cause change in a society. And I want to say that Nelson Mandela would have been influenced by Gandhi, and he would have been influenced too by Henry David Thoreau. That is why Mandela, who had a very violent part of his career in his early life, was able to use his prison years in order to transform his philosophy into one of non-violence when he came out of prison. And that is why he was able to move from peace to peace and reconciliation. On the basis of that, on the basis of ideas about dissent, on the basis of ideas about what a democracy is and what is the individual right in the democracy, including the right to dissent, great upheavals have taken place in the world. All right, the beginning of the decolonization process in India. All right, the commitment to freedom and democracy and individual rights in the United States, which people are prepared to die for, and which the Constitution guarantees. The freedom and social justice movement led by Martin Luther King, which contributed to significant progress in the Lyndon Johnson years in law for people of color in the United States to earn equal rights, which is something that they have to be alert to and continue to fight for in the United States. But it started with the rebellion of somebody like Martin Luther King. And you had the situation, of course, with Mandela, where he also brought down an entire system of injustice that had existed for years the entrenched racial division of the society and constitutionally protected apartheid. He brought that system down in South Africa on the basis of what? The ability to dissent and assert the democratic right to freedom of expression and the expression of ideas. I want to say, therefore, with that knowledge, I am deeply disturbed at Dr. Rowley, his ministers and the government, and the way they behave in this country. They talk badly to people. They talk arrogantly to people. They insult people. They disrespect people in the society. They want no dissent. They name call in the society. They have done it with people at the university. They have done it with economists. They have done it with people in the society who are dissenters, people who have a different point of view. And I resent the fact that a government of this country, under the constitution that we have, committed to democracy in Trinidad and Tobago, would be a government that is bent on upholding repressive laws and repressing the democratic freedoms and rights of our people in Trinidad and Tobago. The beginning of dictatorship is the suppression of dissent and the expression of other views. And that then enters, you start with the individual, you go to groups that are easy to isolate, and then pretty soon you have interference with the press, and then pretty soon you have draconian laws being passed that can keep people in check, and then you have the instruments of militarization in your society together with the laws, oppressing the country, suppressing democracy, and keeping the people fettered and in chains. I want to say to you that we have had colonialism and that done. We have had self-government and we have passed that. We are now we have been through independence and we are now gone on to republicanism. And we must take no crap from the people who are elected by us into office, telling us what to think, what to say, when to speak, what ideas to espouse, and how to express our views, and whether we can dissent or not. I am entirely opposed to that kind of oppressive mindset. And if it is one thing that we must bring a halt to immediately is that. I am not taking any issue with any particular issue. We've had the issue of Satmaraj and the interference with the media. We have had the Media Association coming out to challenge these things. We've had the situation now with Duke. And I want to say, you know the story. What happens is that when you take the rights of people that most people might think are on the extreme end of the spectrum, don't fool yourself. You might think that those rights are for somebody who is on a point in the spectrum where you are not. But from the time that right is taken, your rights have also gone. And I want to say to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, let us guard our freedom. Let us respect democracy. Let us understand the importance of multiple views and contending views in the society. And let us understand the significance of dissent for democracy. What we need to do in Trinidad and Tobago is deepen democracy. We need to deepen democracy by ensuring that everybody has the opportunity for as much economic independence as possible, so that they will not be dependent on the state, and so that the state cannot oppress them because they are dependent on the state. I want to say that we need to deepen the democracy to create the conditions in which, out of contending views and dissenting views in the democratic order, you can pick sense from nonsense, create the conditions for reasonable and civil discourse, and at the end of it, build a consensus. and build a consensus in such a way that when you come to a decision, ultimately, even those who disagree with the final decision, because they have had a part in it and had a chance to contribute to it and express their opinion in it, are willing to go along and give it a chance. So today I speak for democracy, I speak for dissent, I speak for the contending views in an open and democratic society, and I am absolutely against authoritarian government, state control of the thought process, the speaking process, the writing process of individuals, government control of individual freedom, government interference to influence the press and to suppress free opinion in the press, and government interference and violation of the Constitution to infringe on the individual and privacy rights of individuals in the country. I thank you very much for listening to me, and I want to hear your own views, and if you have questions, I will try to answer them as best I can. Thank you very much for listening.
So good morning, Dr. Tiwari. So one of the questions that we have this morning is, democracy is our ability to choose a political party and also our ability to voice our discontent in the light of their lack of ability to fulfill their mandate. How can we continue to do so when the PNM is commanding the population into submission, using tools such as sedition law to stifle their voices?
We have to stand up. We have to say no to the government. The opposition will say no in Parliament to any kind of draconian laws that have come. If we were listening to the government and their subversion of the opposition by saying we were unpatriotic, that we don't want, that we are against the country, that we are against progress and so on, many of the draconian laws that they brought to Parliament would have been passed, because we would have bowed, and being afraid of public opinion, we would have gone along. But we fought them on every issue, and they've had to buckle. Some laws they've had to withdraw, some they've had to amend, some they have violated the process by taking 3/5 majority laws and making them simple majority laws. Okay? But we will continue to fight. You can rely on the opposition to fight for the people and for the rights of the people in Parliament, and we will continue to do that, but the people have to stand up now. The government is going too far. We have to stand up.
Dr. Tiwari, do you believe the Constitution needs reform? And if your answer is affirmative, can you give an insight on what do you think is lacking from the Constitution, and how does mediating these deficiencies can, one, benefit the population, and two, how can it restore public confidence in our politicians?
I think the Constitution is in need of reform. And the Constitution reform should only be done through a consultative process, and at the end of the day coming to a reasonable conclusion of what any modified or transformed Constitution should be. I think what we have had is an evolution of the Constitution from a self-governing state and ultimately to independence, and that was a compromise constitution that was made at Marlborough House. When the Republican Constitution was made in 1976, that the Constitution we carry now, that was done by Dr. Eric Williams at the time, Prime Minister, basically lambasting the Wooding Commission that had reported and that had asked for significant changes to the constitutional process. And he threw out that constitution, and he basically had a new constitution written. The author of that constitution is generally regarded to be Ellis Clark as a dominant player in the writing of the Constitution. There may have been others. History is a very complex thing, and you don't always know the full truth unless you have the research and the investigation that goes to identify it. But clearly we have outlived the current Republican Constitution that we have now, and we need to do more things, and that has to do with what I just said, which is that you we really need to move now to deepen democracy in the country and to give power to the people in a significant way, not in a rabble-rousing populist way, but in a way that really makes the voice of the people count and strengthens democracy between elections. That is what we need to do now in the Constitution, and let the people have a stronger say in the governance process, and let the governance process be more in check. Now that what kind of constitution we need is a whole discussion that we need to have. When Mr. Manning had put forward the constitution for an executive presidency and other things, I was principal at the University of the West Indies at the time, and we did a version of what we felt was important in constitutional reform. And in the People's Partnership Manifesto of 2010, we had a number of constitutional issues that we raised at that time. But I think all that time has passed now, and we really need to rethink the Constitution in the wake of changes that are taking place globally, because a lot of things are happening globally. A lot of rethinking is going on ideologically. A lot of issues that are happening in the world affect us here. You know, don't think for a minute that radical terrorism of every kind does not affect us here. We've got to take that into account. Don't think for a minute that white nationalism doesn't affect us here. You've got to take that into account. Don't think that the massive immigration issue, which has become a global worldwide problem, and the emergent insularity affect us here. And therefore, we've got to take all those global things into account, as well as our own history and experience here in Trinidad and Tobago, in order to refashion a new constitutional order for Trinidad and Tobago that is more deeply democratic, that creates the conditions for shared prosperity in the society, that builds the capacity for social cohesion and national unity and the building of a nation. You know, we are a country, yes, we are a nation, but we have not built that sustainable nation yet. We have more to go. And more than that, we have to create the conditions in which the rights and freedoms of people, in a situation in which all rights and freedoms are being threatened globally by extreme players in the system, need to be thought through in a way that guarantees freedom and democracy and rights, but at the same time protects the whole, protects the society. Okay? So maybe on another day I can address the issue of some of the principal issues that we might be concerned about in Trinidad and Tobago about constitutional reform. But thanks for the question.
Dr. Tiwari, the PNM uses the Constitution as a tool of convenience. In many instances, we see the Attorney General removing the two-thirds majority clause necessary for the bills that have the potential to infringe on the rights of persons, passing them with a simple majority. Can anything be done to prevent him from doing so in the future instances?
Well, the only thing that you can do is oppose them in spite of the fact that they can pass a law with a simple majority. Protest about it, point out the wrongness of it, and when the bill is passed, you challenge them in court. And that has to do with the separation of powers. And if the separation of powers work, they can be challenged and they can lose, and the people can win.
Dr. Tiwari, does the Constitution provide for any humanitarian rights, and does Trinidad and Tobago adhere to these rights when enforcing laws?
We do and we don't. There's a difference between law and practice, and unless the practice is challenged in the court, you never know what you have to allow and enforce. But our Constitution is very deeply ingrained in, first of all, the acknowledgement of the existence of God. That's the first thing. The Constitution talks about moral and spiritual values in the preamble, and our Constitution also speaks deeply to the issues of human rights. And the issues of human rights are also connected with the various international agreements that we sign as part of the community of nations. So all of these things we need to be acknowledged, most progressive laws that we sign in the world system. So human rights are a very important part of the guarantees of a constitution.
Dr. Tiwari, this is a question that we have from last week that was unanswered. So is there a national plan for traffic management which is increasing exponentially and contributes to lower productivity and increased frustration?
Yes. If you, I don't want to be political about that answer because I know you're looking for a solution to what is essentially the 2015 manifesto of the People's Partnership. You will see that together with experts in the field, we put together a plan for the business of traffic management. In a manifesto, you can't write a whole paper, so it will be limited to about a page and a half in the manifesto. But we did, in fact, discuss and put together a traffic management plan that can work, and I will tell you some of the elements of it. One of the elements of a traffic management plan really has to do with decentralization of government services. Okay? Port of Spain at the same time, and all your public servants are in Port of Spain. And all of them are coming home from Port of Spain at the same time in the afternoon. You're bound to have a traffic problem. So decentralization is a key part of that. The second issue has to do with development, and we had the concept of growth poles. If together with decentralization you have the concept of growth poles, and you have local and regional economies developing together with places that have already developed, a lot of new private sector jobs will emerge in communities spread all across the country. And that also will add to the solution of the traffic management problem, because decentralization and the growth poles that you create will in fact make sure that all the people are not going in the same direction at any one point in time in the country. And the third issue was economic zones, because if you have economic zones across the country that cater to, that also helps in the traffic management problem, because people go where the jobs are, where they have to work, and they come back from where they work to the homes depending on where they live. And so that there needs to be some link between housing strategy, home ownership strategy, community development strategies, and these growth pole and decentralization strategies. And then the fourth thing would be to build car parks across the country in which people could park their cars and ride. If you had car parks along the east-west corridor, for instance, people would be willing to take transportation that takes them directly from Sangre Grande to Port of Spain, or from Arima to Port of Spain, or from Tunapuna to Port of Spain. All right, or to park in Port of Spain and then take a shuttle to go into the city. You understand what I mean? And so too you could manage San Fernando and a whole range of things like that. And we actually have in the manifesto the locations for some of those car parks. The third thing that was important is that we tried to get something that the country is already comfortable with, and that would not cause a big set of expenses, such as a rapid rail or something like that, which in fact the feasibility study for that cost $500 million. And that is without putting down one nail on a track for a rapid rail. So the solution we came up with was a solution that other people had come up with in other parts of the world, like Cambridge in the United Kingdom, like some of the South American countries, especially Colombia, in which they basically had luxury buses by and large, in which people could park and then take these luxury buses into their place of work, to the point of their place of work. And what we would do with that is that we would create a bus lane in which that bus would travel north or south, east or west, as the case might be, and you increase the frequency and the predictability of the time so that people could use it. Because as one former governor of a state in Colombia said, an advanced country is not one in which everybody owns cars or in which everybody drive a car. An advanced and enlightened country is one in which those who own the cars and who can afford more and better decide to take public transportation because it is better, it is more efficient, and it contributes to the environment. Okay? So we had a plan, we will have a plan, and if we get the opportunity with the help of the people, we will execute such a plan. And it's a plan not just created by politics, it's a plan created by experts.
Dr. Tiwari, this was another question that was unanswered last week due to the interest of time. The healthcare system often looks clear accountability, would encourage adoption of standards of care and quality improvement. How would you go about aligning financial and personal incentives to optimize outcome?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question completely, but what I would say is this. I think what you want to have in a health system is one that works, and in which every health facility works, whether it's a health center, all right, and we have, I can't remember what's the number now, but I think we have close to 100 of them in the country. So whether the healthcare system works properly really depends on how efficiently it is managed, whether you have doctors there, whether you have nurses there, what kind of care they can give you for what, and whether they are available at the times that you really need them for the people who live in the communities. So the first thing is to begin to have a system in which primary health care is properly administered and managed through the health system in the communities, through the health centers. The second thing is to have a preventative strategy for health. What are the big health problems in Trinidad and Tobago? Diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney problems, what's the other one? Heart disease. Those are the top four. I mean, people have cancer, they have other problems, etc. But these are the top four. And they are all related. Do you know that? If you get diabetes, you could get high blood pressure, you could get heart problems, you could get renal failure. Okay? Because there's a deterioration process that sets in with these. So the first thing to do is to try to prevent these things. When I was at the University of the West Indies, together with Dr. Paul Tilaksing, Sir Paul Tilaksing, who is a professor there, we were able to get a significant donation from the Bhagwan Singh family of $5 million. And we set up an organization called DERPI, which is Diabetes Education and Prevention. I forget what's the name, what the acronym means now, but basically it was supposed to be dedicated to diabetes prevention, etc. Education and prevention. And a PhD student who I supported from the Institute of Critical Thinking actually did research based on thousands of students in the secondary school system in this country to show that even at that early age, children were either had diabetes or predisposed to diabetes. And we had a plan that, if properly executed and the Ministry of Health got involved, we could actually create the conditions in which in 10 to 15 years we could create a disease-free generation as far as diabetes is concerned. Okay? And I think that that is something that we can still do. So the other thing after that, so you need the primary healthcare system working and efficient and available. You need, secondly, a preventative intervention, knowing what the big diseases are in the country, and that means managing lifestyle and food and all of those things. Thirdly, you need to make the hospitals efficient and effective. And the only way that you can do that is really to not just have effective management of each hospitals, but you need also to have a national insurance system for health that allows people to choose where they get their health care in the country, and which allows for both private and public, and which involves the local private sector insurance companies. That way everybody is part of the solution, nobody loses, and the citizen gets a choice. And in that kind of system, the public healthcare system would be forced to meet the standards of the best private healthcare hospitals. You need to improve. The public hospitals are good in terms of quality, but sometimes they are not well equipped. You have administrative efficiencies, the machines don't work. You have to wait long for an appointment. When you get an appointment, you go there, sometimes they're not ready, you have to come back. You know, so we have to build out those inefficiencies into it and really make healthcare system work in this country. I want to say this, more and more, based on economic knowledge and based on the understanding of how societies develop, and based on an understanding of how important human capital is in the development process, and based on a consideration that development means nothing unless human beings are developed in the process and get an opportunity to contribute. More and more education and health and how you measure progress in these are becoming very, very important things in the international assessment for the achievement of countries. Okay, I think we've reached the end of our time now. I want to thank you for your participation and for the questions that you've asked. I hope what I've said to you makes sense and at least forces you to think a little bit, prompts you in the direction of thinking. And I hope also that if you tried to get on a question and you didn't, or you hesitated to send a question, next time you'll come on and ask some questions so that we can engage them. Just remember, democracy is very, very important to us. I want to close on that. And we must not compromise on democracy. And we must never surrender our individual rights and freedom to the state, to a bunch of politicians, or to a government. It is better we have our rights and freedoms than the government, whoever that government is, takes our rights and freedoms away. It is better in our hands than in the hands of an oligarchy. Thank you very much for listening to me. Good day.